Well, welcome everybody. This is Hank Zarnicki, the networking chair for the Lean Enterprise Division of ASQ. We are going to start our webinar, Sustaining Change, in about 2 minutes. Well, good afternoon, good morning to some, good evening to others. This is Hank Zarnicki with ASQ's Lean Enterprise Division. Thank you for attending our Sustaining Change, Are You Asking the Wrong Questions webinar. Few logistics items. One, everybody is muted, so all the attendees for the webinar will be muted. If you have questions, if you look on the right side, just in case you're not familiar with it, there's a triangle there where you can begin to ask questions. Please send your questions as they come up. We are going to hold all the questions for Shawn until the end. Shawn has allowed about 10 minutes at the end of the presentations for some Q&A. And the presentation has been provided. I know that some folks have already downloaded it from the email that went out from our Lean Enterprise Division members. So it is 12:31, and I'd like to welcome Shawn Perkins from the Clorox company. Shawn has been there right at 13 years as an improvement methods lead. Basically, he is a coach for multiple sites of Clorox for developing leaders and also for improving the process. So he has both of those aspects. How do they have good business results? And then how do they begin to have their team members become stronger problem solvers? Shawn is going to present what he presented at the ASQ World Conference a few months ago. Very well received, had very high marks out there, and we are very excited to have Shawn join us as a presenter today. So Shawn, I'm going to turn it over to you and turn it loose. And at the end, the last few minutes, we'll begin to have a few questions. So thank you, Shawn.
Hey, my pleasure. I've been a long-term member of the American Society for Quality, a senior member now, actually, and I have a couple of certifications. I'm a certified Six Sigma Black Belt as well as a certified quality auditor, and so I have great value for what the ASQ brings, and I have great value for their World Conference on Quality and Improvement because I've worked in both of those areas and have had a chance to present at a couple of those World Conferences now, as well as volunteering at past ones as well. So appreciate the opportunity here, Hank. Thank you. I do very much respect all the work that goes into these webinars because I do a lot of different training and learning improvements across the different sites that the Clorox company has. And so again, appreciate the work that you put into it, Hank. Now, this particular session was one that I presented at the World Conference on Quality Improvement this year in Seattle, a great conference. And if you have not had a chance to attend one of those in the past, I do highly recommend them, both from a networking and from a learning opportunity standpoint. They have some great keynote speakers, as well as a lot of great concurrent sessions that are going on. There's a lot of those, a lot of different types of content that you can dive into, and you have the opportunity to get even the presentations that you were not able to attend, you're able to get those as recorded sessions after the conference. So I can't recommend that highly enough for those of you who might not have gone to one in the past. This particular presentation, though, was on sustaining change. Are we asking the wrong questions? And what I had noticed within Clorox was that many times we did seem to be asking some of the wrong questions when it came to sustaining the change once we have done some sort of a continuous improvement project or some sort of continuous improvement work. So we're going to be talking about prioritizing those sustaining actions so that you can ensure that sustainment stays in place and that we can avoid unnecessary work, because sometimes we can do a little bit too much. If we would just reframe things a little bit differently, maybe we could save ourselves a little bit of time and effort. Additionally, we want to talk about learning to choose the best sustaining steps dependent upon the type of change that's made, and also being able to critique your sustainment plan using a process input and output diagram. Now, just a little bit about me here first. My name is Shawn Perkins, and you see in the upper left there, I'm there with my wife and my two kids at the Opryland Hotel. This picture was taken a few years back there. Actually, Opryland Hotel is where they held one of the ASQ WCQI conferences a few years back. So my family had the opportunity to join me there, since I am based at a plant here in Kentucky. So Nashville, Tennessee was just right down the road from us. We had a great time there. My daughter Amanda on the left, my son Eric, and then my wife Debbie there with me. Now, I do live in Kentucky in slightly rural area. We live in a log home, and I love the way our house looks in the wintertime, around Christmas time especially. It looks like a postcard almost. Now, personally, I was a fan of the Star Wars movies. I grew up with the Star Wars toys and just really loved the movies, and they just sparked my imagination a great deal. And so when the Disney parks started hosting some of the Star Wars half marathons and the different races that they had, that really engaged me to help sustain my health plan, to really keep that in focus. And then on the very right-hand side, you'll see our dog Pepper. I think she's a bit of a camera hound there. See, she looks like she's posing for the picture. That's just a little bit about me personally. But I do work for the Clorox company. Now, I started with Clorox in about 2000, and I started in the quality realm there as a quality manager for the Kingsford charcoal plant in Summer Shade, Kentucky. And it is kind of interesting because the Clorox company is, of course, well known for the signature bleach product, but they also have a number of other products under that the Clorox company umbrella. Those are shown down at the bottom of the screen there, including things like Pine Sol and Burt's Bees and Kingsford charcoal, Casey Masterpiece barbecue sauce, Fresh Step cat litter, Glad bags, Formula 409, lots of different products, probably some of them that you've got in your homes as we speak. But when I started at the Kingsford plant in Summer Shade, Kentucky, I was really encouraged with how Clorox was heading in the realm of quality and in continuous improvement, because in a previous role that I had, I was the quality lab supervisor for a laundry detergent manufacturing company. And being in the quality group there were some things that never quite set right with me about how the quality group was managed and how they were perceived within the plant. See, they were perceived as the quality police. The quality group would hold product, they would disposition product, and if the packaging line saw a quality problem, if they could get it out the door before the next quality inspection, they saw it as being okay product. There was no real ownership of quality on the packaging line. And so that was one of those things. It just didn't sit well with me. In fact, the plant would go to the extent where they would spend thousands and thousands of dollars, capital equipment being installed, in order to rework product faster, in order to blend product back into the system more quickly. So they were adding chute conveyors, bucket conveyors, dump back stations, in essence, to hide the problem of off-quality product. And that never did set well with me. Think about if those resources could have been applied to actually solving the root causes of the problems. And that was something they never did ask. They would ask, how could we dump it back faster? How do we disposition it better? But they would not stop and ask, why did these problems happen in the first place? And what can we do about them to keep them from happening again in the future? So when I started at the Kingsford plant, the charcoal plant, making charcoal briquettes, I was really encouraged with their quality group because they were asking some of those questions. They were asking, what can we do to the briquette formula so that it will light faster and burn longer? They were asking some of the questions around what can we do within the process settings in order to ensure that the briquette holds together within the bag and doesn't crumble, and the end user pours out a bunch of broken briquettes into the grill and has a really unsatisfactory experience with our product. So they were asking those questions and doing a lot of great experimental work and root cause analysis in order to make the product better. So I then moved into a corporate quality role for about a year, and then was able to move into what is called our WCO group, World Class Organization. And the World Class Organization group, I was really excited about being able to join that because they were expanding out even farther. They weren't just looking at quality problems. They were looking for causes of other types of problems as well. They were looking to improve things like line efficiency and trying to drive cost savings so that we're not wasting money buying things that we don't need. And so it really did encourage me to see that, hey, my world didn't just apply within Kingsford Charcoal. It wasn't just that small realm there, but also all these other products that Clorox happens to own. All this continuous improvement and true quality mentality would apply in each of those areas as well. So I was able to expand my view of the company beyond just Kingsford Charcoal and move into all these other different types of products, and it was really great experience to be able to see how all these different products are made and visit the different locations and meet the different people that were making them. Now, when I first joined our WCO, the World Class Organization Group, I did a site visit. And this site visit took place in Rogers, Arkansas. We have a Glad manufacturing plant there that makes primarily garbage bags, but also other products like a press and seal or some of the sandwich bags. But when I went to the plant, it was so that I could get my feet wet and really start to learn about the continuous improvement work that was happening across the company. Our WCO group was still fairly new, so I was really just starting to get a taste for true continuous improvement work. When I went to the plant, one of the first things I did was to go on a plant tour with one of their continuous improvement folks from within the plant. And he took me around in order to showcase some of the CI work that was going on within the plant. First thing he did was he took me to a piece of equipment that was running large rolls of plastic, converting them into garbage bags. And when I went to that particular piece of equipment, he told me, we changed the process for how they change out those large rolls. The operator on the line is now going to change out that roll in this certain way. And he described how it would happen. We watched, and the person did not do it that way. And he looked at me inside and said, well, he was supposed to have done it this other way. We then walked to another piece of equipment and looked at it. And he was describing to me on the way how they had come up with this new type of rail that was going to stop a specific type of jam from happening on the finished cases that were coming off the line. We got there and he pointed to where the rail was supposed to be, and it wasn't there. He sighed and looked at me and said, well, it was supposed to be there. They found it and it was off in a corner where somebody had taken it off. And so in just a matter of that one plant tour, I was able to see how changes that were made to a process, a people process, or a piece of equipment can be undone. And so that's one of the reasons why this particular subject is so close to my heart here, because I experienced it right from the get-go. Now, for me to be successful in this particular presentation, I have to first convince you of the importance of the topic. And in that regard, I'm going to try to convince you of three things. First, that change is happening, and it's happening a lot more quickly. Now, you don't have to answer this out loud. You're welcome to type some numbers into the chat, but here's a question for you. How long does it take to reach 50 million users? So 2 examples. For the telephone in the late 1800s, how long did it take to get to 50 million telephone users? And for the Angry Birds game, the Angry Birds app in 2009, how long did it take to get to 50 million users? I'll give you just a few seconds to think through that and maybe throw in some comments into the chat if you choose to. So just a few seconds here. How long for 50 million users for the telephone in the late 1800s and for the Angry Birds app in 2009? Well, this particular graphic was by G. Coffey Anand, and it was using data from a report that was written by 2 Oxford University economists. And they did a study in order to find out how long did it take to reach 50 million users. And for the telephone, there in the late 1800s, it took 75 years to reach 50 million users. And as you go down into the newer and newer technology, you'll see that the radio took 38 years, television 13 years, the internet 4 years, Facebook took 3.5 years, the iPod 3 years. Now the number's starting to really drop down. Then if you drop down to finally Angry Birds at the very bottom, it took Angry Birds 35 days to reach 50 million users, compared to 75 years for the telephone. So change is happening faster and faster. Some of this change is happening to us. Some of this change should be things that we are intentionally trying to put in place in order to make things better. But the point being, we want to hold on to the changes that we intentionally make so that they don't go away. And we can expect that there's going to be a lot more changes that can be happening as technology continues to get better and better. And as our manufacturing and our computer processes and technology continues to change. So second, I have to convince you that change not being sustained is a bad thing. It's not something that we want to happen. And I'm talking about changes in regards to, hey, we've done some continuous improvement work and we made a change to a process or some equipment that we want to stay in place. And so if that change is not sustained, well, hey, the problem that we were trying to solve is going to come back. We've wasted those resources solving the problem the first time because we're not getting those benefits any longer. And then sometime in the future, we may have to be resolving that same problem again, expending that many more resources in order to put countermeasures back into place. Well, at least we tried, right? But unfortunately, even if you try, you may be struggling to keep your head above the loss, the sea of waste, the sea of loss. So we want to make sure that those problems do not come back again in the future. So at least you tried. So, well, what I'm going to say here is do or do not, there is no try. Let's make these things happen and really lock them down so that the problem cannot come back in the future. And so lastly, I have to convince you that these sorts of problems do impact you in your site. So why change is not sustained might be happening for a number of different reasons, and perhaps you've seen some of these. So have other problems popped up that would force someone to undo the change that was put into place. So there were some unintended consequences to the change that was put into place. Maybe there were communication lapses or training lapses as the change was being put into place. So not everybody knew exactly what was going on or were truly trained in what this change was all about, why it was even being done in the first place. Or maybe you've seen where equipment process changes have been physically undone because of those other problems that that popped up. If you have experienced any of these things, then hey, maybe there's some content in here for you to benefit from. So another quick question for you to think about. Whenever we talk about continuous improvement work, whenever we come to the end of it, many times we may hear the question asked, how do we sustain the blank? So I want you to think through, what are some of the words or phrases that have been used to fill in the blank? How do we sustain the what? So think about it for just a minute. At the end of a continuous improvement effort, someone might ask, how do we sustain the blank? What word or phrase might fill in the blank? Now, probably some of you would have used one of these two words. Either how do we sustain the change, or how do we sustain the improvement? Now, it seems to fit pretty well whenever we say, how do we sustain the change? How do we sustain the improvement? Those sound like good questions to be asking. What I'm going to throw out to you, though, is that words mean things. And sometimes those things can be rather generic, or they can be very specific. And in the realm of continuous improvement, which is better, being generic or being specific? Typically, being more specific and being concise and precise in your wording around things is going to be of benefit. And so what's interesting about the words change and improvement is that they could be referring to a lot of different things. They could be referring to the outputs, or they could be referring to the countermeasures that had been implemented in the first place. So where is the focus when we start talking about sustaining change? If you ask the question, how do we sustain the change? How do we sustain the improvement? It depends on who you're talking to as to what they might be meaning. Many times, if you're talking to leadership or supervisors or folks who were not involved in the continuous improvement effort itself, many times when they're talking about it, they're talking about how do we sustain the output. If you were to use other words, they might be asking, how do we sustain the benefit? How do we sustain the gains? How do we sustain this metric, this output metric that we're monitoring? How do we sustain the benefit? How do we sustain this cost savings? How do we sustain this new line efficiency that we've driven towards? And what I'm suggesting is that there is not a direct way that you can sustain any of those things. You cannot sustain the output directly. There was not a knob that you turn that changed the output immediately. No, during the continuous improvement work, you made changes to the inputs and to the process in order to drive that output metric. So instead of that question being, how do we sustain the result? If you're truly trying to sustain the change, the question should be, how do we sustain the countermeasures? How do we make sure that the physical change to a piece of equipment or the procedural change to a people or information process stays in place and does not change? See, the problem-solving flow usually goes something like this, and every problem-solving process looks a little different, but many times there's some kind of a general flow that looks something like this, in which you see a problem. There's some kind of difficulty, loss, waste, issue that needs to be dealt with. You go and you find the root cause or root causes for that problem. You implement some sort of corrective action that will counteract the root cause. And then if you've got a good improvement process, it's asking, now how do we make sure that we sustain these changes now that they've been made? So that's a common problem-solving flow. Now, the root cause the definition of a root cause, at least as we've defined it within Clorox, is that underlying reason that the specific problem is happening, that once you make a change to it, once you implement the countermeasure there at it, the problem will go away immediately. Now, so in that regard, we kind of make a distinction, because if you have kids, you know that you can continue to ask why, indefinitely. If you think about the 5 whys, you can actually keep asking why a lot more than just 5 times, and kids have a tendency to want to do that. And you can ask why indefinitely if you're not careful. But where we choose to stop asking why is when it is something within the procedure or something within the piece of equipment that we can make a change to, and the problem would go away. We do not dive into the people side of things. We set those aside and leave the people side of things for the sustaining steps. So if there is a sustaining step, if there is a people issue that needs to be dealt with on the training side, we usually call those out within the sustaining steps, because that's how do we get people to continue to do a process in a certain way. The root cause was within the process itself, not being done a certain way, but then we ask, how can we make sure that people do it the right way through our sustaining steps? But the sustaining flow actually asks the questions backwards. So if you maintain good sustaining steps, if you implement good sustaining steps, the corrective actions, the countermeasures that were put in place will always be there. And if the corrective actions are always there, the root cause doesn't come back. And if the root cause doesn't come back, the problem doesn't come back. So it's just reversing the flow when we start talking about sustaining the changes. And so we're trying to sustain the corrective actions. We're trying to sustain the countermeasures. So that's one of the ways that we want to reframe the question. We don't want to try to sustain the gains or the benefits, because there's no way that you can do that directly. You have to sustain the changes that were implemented that generated the output that you want to keep. So just as a few quick examples here, I have an equipment example in which we'll talk about some bottle jams, some Clorox bleach bottles going down the line on a conveyor belt. Also about a people and information process, and that is about the time it takes to create a report that gets circulated around the company. And then lastly, a personal problem. About my personal, hey, one of the things I've been working on is, hey, how do I get healthier? And one of those ways would be to decrease my weight. So the bleach bottle example, the problem, and we're thinking through that process that I was describing earlier, the problem was you have bottles that are jamming at a certain point on the conveyor belt at point X. The root cause, just a simple example here, is that the rail that was guiding the bottles, that right side rail was set in too far. The countermeasure is to set that rail back into the correct position. But if all you do is set that rail in the correct position, hey, it would be really easy for that rail to wander back into a position that is not correct any longer. So the sustaining steps would be potentially, hey, let's weld that rail in place so that it cannot be moved in the future. That is error-proofing it to the point where the problem cannot come back. Next is the process example. Again, a quick, simple example here. The problem is that it's taking 5 days to create a report, and that's a lot of extra time that we don't want to spend waiting on this report to come out. The root cause, one potential root cause here, was that, hey, we were waiting for 3 days for information from Department X. So a lot of that waiting time. So countermeasure for that was, hey, we need to inform Department X of the need for their information 3 days earlier. It turned out it wasn't taking them that long to make it. It was just that they needed to get it into their queue of work so that they could get it to us in time. So they need just to be informed of that need 3 days earlier so that they could get to us on time. And the sustaining steps in, hey, we just need to put some sort of a reminder in our personal systems to be able to put that communication out. We need to be able to remember to do that specific task. So it's really easy to say, oh, we just have to inform the department 3 days earlier. But as you go into the future, how do you make sure that we always remember that? Oh, well, that's why we put in those reminders there. And then lastly, the personal example. Just again, as the weight example here, 25 pounds weighing 25 pounds too much is the problem. The one root cause, at least getting things kicked off, was, hey, I had an unknown calorie consumption. I really didn't know how many calories I was taking into my body. And so the countermeasure was that, hey, I need to track my food consumption in the MyFitnessPal app, a good app that's helped me out quite a bit in being able to track food consumption. Sustaining steps to help me remember to track my food consumption was that, hey, I'm going to set reminders on my calendar and also in another app called To Do in order to just ping myself to help remember to actually do that, because it's so easy, for a person to forget to actually do a task. So hopefully you're seeing that we're moving the focus from the output and we're moving it towards that input of the process. How do we sustain what was actually changed within the input or the process that generates the output that we're wanting to get? So when we talk about sustaining steps, the different actual activities that we would do in order to sustain a physical change or a procedural change, I went through and had to think through them. And when I started evaluating which of those were the most effective, I did find some that really worked out better than others. So if you're talking about sustaining change, there are some sustaining actions that are going to be a lot better if you can do them than others would be. And so I've actually made a hierarchy of the different types of changes, of sustaining steps for changes that falls into a bad, a good, better, and best categories. And I have reasoning behind each of those different categories. So first off is the bad category. And if something is falling in the bad, obviously the root cause is going to be coming back. We're going to be experiencing the problem again in the future. Yeah, it just had little or no impact on the issue itself. And so these are the things we typically want to try to steer away from. And hopefully the obvious one is that we do nothing. If we go and implement a countermeasure and expect it to stay in place, well, you're fooling yourself. Just like the tour that I went on, if all you do is go through and make the change and you do nothing else, you're just setting yourself up for having to resolve that problem again in the future. Now, additionally, something else that I throw in here is informal word-of-mouth communications. If all you do is go out there and tell one or two people, hey, here's kind of what I did here, and there you go, we're done, then you're, again, setting yourself up for failure as well, because you've got no guarantee that that person is going to communicate it to everybody else. You have no guarantee that the new hires coming in are going to hear and understand what that change was about. And you also run the risk of things becoming distorted as that person tells other people, if they happen to tell other people. So just as a quick example of that, one of my favorite shows is the Andy Griffith Show, an older television show starring Andy Griffith as the sheriff of a small town in Mayberry, North Carolina. And he's a widower and trying to raise his son, Opie, who's played by Ron Howard, who incidentally was the director of the new Solo movie recently released. But in this particular skit, you've got Andy and Opie, and they're talking to each other, and Andy is trying to convince Opie that he should give more money to the Underprivileged Children's Fund. Andy's just found out that Opie gave, it was only 2 or 3 cents to this Underprivileged Children's Fund charity that the school was taking up money for. And Andy's trying to convince him that, no, that wasn't the right thing to do. You should really try to help out people better. And their conversation goes something like this. Andy says, I was reading just the other day that there are 400 underprivileged children in this county alone, or 1.5 boys per square mile? And Opie says, confused, I never seen one, Paul. Seen what? A half a boy. And Andy replies, well, it's not really a half a boy, it's a ratio. Horatio who? Andy, not Horatio, a ratio. Mathematics, arithmetic. Okay, forget that part about it. Forget the part about the half a boy. Well, it's pretty hard to forget a thing like that, Paul. Well, try. Poor Horatio. Now, look, Horatio's not the only needy boy. And of course, it goes on from there. But basically, you can see from just this brief conversation of a father and a son that it is very easy for information to get distorted. If a person who's receiving that information doesn't quite understand some of the terms or doesn't quite get the vocabulary that's being used, or maybe they just mishear one of the words and misinterpret something. The moral of the story, one-time word-of-mouth communications are often ineffective. It's like the old telephone game. If you've got a line of people and the first person whispers something into the next person's ear and that person whispers it to the next person, by the time you get to the end of the line, what that last person heard is typically very different than what the first person initially said. So do not rely on that one-time word-of-mouth communication in order to communicate effectively. Communication's a good thing, but these one-time word-of-mouth communications are not are oftentimes not effective like we'd want them to. So the next category of sustaining actions is the good category. In the good category, these problems will come back, but we're trying to minimize the impact of the problem when it does happen to come back. So some examples of this include monitoring the output metrics and the quality. Remember, I said monitoring the outputs, that's one of the wrong questions to be asking. So it's not best. Sometimes we still have to rely on it, but monitoring the output metrics or the output quality is okay to do. But again, just not optimal. That's why it's in the good category rather than the better or the best. If you add redundancy in to the system where you've got an opportunity, if one process goes down, you can divert the flow through a different process. Troubleshooting guides. That falls into our training and qualification department. They manage our troubleshooting guides, but that is a repository of knowledge. It includes a list of all our different pieces of equipment, the problems that might happen on them, and then the root causes that might be causing that problem, and then what you would do about those root causes in order to counteract the problem now that it's happened. And then lastly, training and qualification is the last thing that we put into the good category. I want to talk first just a little bit more about these first three: monitoring the output metrics, the redundant systems, and the troubleshooting guides. Now, these all sound like great things to have, and they are good to have, but they're not the better or the best. And I say that because in order for these tools to be effective, the problem has to have come back. We have to be experiencing the problem again in order for us to get some use out of being able to react when the output metric changes, or to be able to get use out of a redundant system. The other system, the initial system that was being used, has to have gone down. And in order to have value for troubleshooting guides, the problem again has to have come back to the point where we have to go and refer to that troubleshooting guide to figure out what we need to do to make the problem go away. Now, again, these are not bad things. That's why they're in the good category, but these are not optimal. And the last thing that we had in the good category was training. And you think, oh, training, that's an awesome thing. We want to train people. And I say, that's true. We do want to train people. The problem is that when we're training and when we're relying on a person, People have a tendency to forget things. People do not always remember things exactly as they were trained to do them. And especially when they've been doing things for a long time, if you come in and make a change to a process or a piece of equipment, you first have to have them unlearn what they have already learned. They've been doing things for so long sometimes that those neural pathways have already been really inground in their brains. And it's very difficult to get folks to divert off of those old pathways and create new ones. And so whenever changes are relying on people, it is going to be more of a resource drain in order to truly ensure that those changes are being maintained. Because not only do you have to train the people that are already there and break their current biases, you have to train all the new people that are coming on board in this new way of doing things. And you have to do some sort of checks downstream to make sure that the process doesn't mutate in the future. So you can see that training can be problematic. I do not envy people who fall into a training and qualification group, for these very reasons, because they are having to break some of those biases and help ensure that people always remember how to do things a certain way just through the training processes that they have. But this leads us into the next category of sustaining actions, which is the better category. Now, in this category, the problem might come back, but we are limiting the probability that it will come back in the future. So examples here move us from an output metric to an in-process metric. Is there something about the process that we can monitor to help ensure that the process is doing what it's supposed to? And if the process is doing what it's supposed to, then the output we're going to be getting is going to be what we want it to be also. Additionally, similar to in-process metrics, are there input audits or inspections that need to be done to ensure that what we're receiving into our process is what it's supposed to be? So basically, we're switching that focus from the output metric to the in-process metric, or that input that's coming into the process. So putting our eyes and our tests and our checks on the inputs and the in-process rather than the output. Next is task reminders. So when we were talking about training and qualification, we said that sometimes it's difficult for people to remember to do certain things in certain ways. So to have some sort of a reminder for people to do certain things is often of benefit, and there are many different ways that we have of doing that. We'll describe an example here in just a moment. A check sheet and a checklist is one way that we can help people remember to do certain things certain ways. But even a little bit better than that are things like visual controls. And I have another slide on visual controls, but these are just ways that you can make it so that just obvious at a glance, you can tell right from wrong. So it makes it less likely for a person to do something the wrong way. Couple of examples here of the task reminders we were just talking about here in this better category. On the left-hand side, what you see is a portion of one of our clean, inspect, and lube standards that we have for one of our pieces of equipment within a plant in the Clorox company. And over there, it's listing out, in this case, some of the things that you want to do to clean the piece of equipment to help make sure that it stays in its base condition, so that the problems we experience when it's not in base condition do not come back. So this is a task reminder for the person on the line to do certain things at a certain frequency. Typically here, we're doing things either shiftly, daily, weekly, or monthly. Whenever it comes to a quarterly or yearly frequency, those sorts of tasks typically go into our preventative maintenance list for the maintenance group to conduct, because those are usually more intense and more skill required to actually make them happen. But we try to enable the people within the packaging lines and the processing areas to be able to take care of the equipment that they own and that they work on day in and day out. And in order to do that, we just help them out with the task reminders on, hey, here are the critical things that should be done in order to make sure that the equipment will remain in its base condition, and so that you don't have to deal with the problems that might arise if it's not. On the right-hand side is a screenshot of the To-Do app that I use personally for both personal and business purposes. Talked about the weight example earlier, and you can see here this is just a checklist of the different things that I do in order to set a healthy example for my family. Then one of those things is eating a certain number of calories, sleeping a certain amount of time, exercising a certain amount, and then also drinking a certain amount of water. Set those in that To-Do app. I'm regularly in that app, and so I see those things and I get pinged about it. You've got those red badges that pop up on the icon that lets you know, hey, you still have things to do today that you said you were going to do. And I do this for health. I also do it for business purposes also. So if I have something that I have to do on a certain day, it will ping me in the To-Do app that, hey, this is something you need to make sure and get done in order so that you can keep your projects moving correctly. So visual controls were also in that better category. The things like labels and colors and lights, basically, how do we make right and wrong obvious at a glance? That is a real stoplight. Can you imagine pulling up to that and trying to figure out what am I actually supposed to do? So that's a bad example of a visual control. But a stoplight is a visual control. It's telling you what you should be doing at a certain point in time. I had a need for an extension cord. And ordered one from Amazon and received it and opened it up and laid it out, and I got to looking at the end that plugged into the wall, and I saw all these labels. Now, you may have noticed something similar in on ladders, but I noticed all these labels on the extension cord, and when I got to looking at them, I got to wondering, wow, how likely is it that a person is going to look through all those labels and find the information that they actually need? Then I looked at the other end of the extension cord. There were a couple more labels over there. So on the extension cord, there were 10 small labels, only one, maybe two of which contained information that I would have had value for. So how likely is it that I would actually go through and look through all those in order to find the information that I needed? Well, it's pretty low. And so don't do something like that. Bad labels, over-labeling, small illegible labels are not good examples of visual controls. Here are some good examples of visual controls here. You see the gauge in the upper left that is making it obvious at a glance where that pressure setting should be. On the right hand side, it's a measure of how much stretch a particular chain has gone through. Once it drops down into the red, hey, it's time to replace it. And then that brings it back up into the green section, like the right bottom picture shows. And then a real interesting one for me is on the lower left, and that being the gas gauge. Of course, the gas gauge itself is a great visual control so that you don't run out of fuel in the middle of interstate in the middle of nowhere. But traveling for work like I do and jumping from rental car to rental car like I do, something that has saved me time and effort on a number of occasions is that little triangle to the left of the gas pump. That little triangle there is telling you which side of the car the gas tank is on. That's the side that you need to pull in so that you can pump gas into the car. I can't tell you how many times in the past I would be in a rental car and would pull into the wrong side, having forgotten to check which side the gas cap was actually on. So I love that little triangle because it has saved me a number of times. But it's a great quick visual indicator to help save that time and effort. And then lastly here, we've got the best category. These are these items would include activities so that the problem cannot come back in the future. These are going to give us the maximum benefit for being able to sustain the change. And this has to do with true error proofing, making problems impossible. The term poka-yoke is typically used here. As I understand it, the term poka-yoke, or there may have been a separate term, initially the term that was used meant something, instead of error proofing, it meant something more like idiot proofing. And of course, people weren't too receptive to that particular term. So people backed away from the idiot proofing term and moved more towards the error proofing term, because hey, let's face it, we as individuals can easily be distracted. We've got other things on our mind. We've got other work that should be going on. We have personal things that we bring into work with us. And so it is very easy for us not to follow through with the things that we're supposed to do in a certain way. And so just a quick example of the true error proofing there on the left-hand side is just showing the two gas pumps there. If you put diesel into a car that does not run on diesel, it can mess up an engine pretty badly. And so what they've done is made the diesel gas pumps, you can tell a little bit here in the picture, they've made the diesel gas pumps a little bit larger so that they will not fit into the gas tank of a car that runs on the regular fuel. So that's how you error-proof something, to make sure that a problem cannot come back. One thing that I have started doing within Clorox is a training on root cause analysis. And when I started doing this, I wanted to come up with a creative way to do the training. And so I started using a mousetrap board game. If you're familiar with it, it's a really fun interactive game in which you get to work with a big piece of equipment there in the board. And it's been a great learning opportunity for many folks. But if you've played the mousetrap game, you know that you have to assemble the game first. And there's many ways that Milton Bradley and Hasbro have gone through and error-proofed it so that the game cannot be assembled incorrectly. And so during the root cause analysis training that I do, I have people look at the game and actually call out how have they error-proofed it so that it cannot be done incorrectly. And these concepts apply on the much larger pieces of manufacturing equipment that we have within the company. And so it's a great, simple way of showing people and demonstrating to people the value of error proofing and how do you make things physically impossible to be done the wrong way. Procedural error proofing. So we talk about equipment error proofing. There's also procedural error proofing that can be done, especially in computer and electronic systems. You can have entry checks, autocorrect, autofill that can be done that can greatly impact a people process. Additionally, there are cameras and motion detectors that if it's a physical process that someone's doing, that the cameras and motion detectors can actually help in making sure that a procedure is done the correct way. So going back to the bottle jam example that we talked about at the very start, let's just go through the bad, good, better, best quickly. So bad thing to do, once you figured out that rail needed to be moved back in the right spot, would just be to go tell a couple of people on the line. Maybe they hear it, maybe they don't, maybe they tell the next person, maybe they don't. A good thing to do would be to add this jam to the troubleshooting guide and then train people on that adjustment point and the importance of that adjustment point. A better thing to do would be to add visual indicators on the line, the visual controls that show where that rail should be set. That way somebody has to blatantly ignore those visual controls and not react to them if they're set in the wrong place. And then the best thing to do, weld that rail in place so that it cannot move. Selecting the best sustaining steps within Clorox had been problematic in the past. So one of the things I tried to do, and this is just a snippet of a larger matrix, what we tried to do was come up with some key questions that you might ask for procedural or physical changes to help indicate what sort of sustaining steps you might take. So you can see over here on the left-hand side, you've got the good, better, and best rankings, the general categories like air proofing and visual controls, as well as the more specific sustaining step that you would take, which would include the specific types of training and qualification documents and specific types of visual controls or air proofing methods that you might use. So depending on what questions you might ask, you could have triggers that tell you, oh, we need to go do certain sustaining steps. It's not perfect, but it gives people a starting point to start saying, wow, I could do this to help sustain the change for this continuous improvement effort that I just got done with. And then the last thing to really talk to here is just analyzing the sustainment plan. We talked about the input, process, and output diagram. Then I've also put people down there at the bottom side as well to represent the training and qualification side. So if you are relying on the output metric and people, you could very easily have to put a lot more effort, and each X represents a sustaining step that you might take. So if you're dealing with that bottle jam, you may have to go train lots of different people on lots of different things, and you may have to monitor the output to make sure that the jam doesn't come back again in the future. Whereas you could get by with doing less if you work on the process and the input. And you're going to be much more effective if you work on the process itself and the input. So if you put visual controls within the process, if you weld the rail in place so that it cannot move, you're going to be much more effective at being able to sustain that rail being in the proper placement. And this is representing the weld in place. The large X is that true error proofing. It cannot move at that point. So you have to train less. You have to monitor less because you've made it virtually impossible, if not impossible, for the problem to come back in the future. So as you look at your sustainment plan, you could map out for each of the sustaining steps that you took, does it impact in input, the process, or the output, or the people, the training qualification side, so that you can gauge, hey, are we looking more like this, where we've truly error-proofed and can take less action, or are we looking more like the initial one here, where, hey, all of our efforts are on the output and the people, which that's good, but there's that risk that things could fall apart in the future. Now, up to this point, we've talked about things to do after the countermeasure has been implemented, but there are a few things prior to the countermeasure that can be done. So you want to consider unintended consequences. So before you go make a change, think about what are those 10 things that could go haywire downstream after we make the change. Get the feedback from the users of the process, because they are better going to be able to tell you some of the risks and some of the details that they see day in and day out. And lastly, get the leadership buy-in. That will help you, because leadership can help ask some of the right questions if you prime them for it. So to me, in summary, there's no sadder waste than having to resolve. That's not resolving, that's resolving a problem over and over again. So would ask you to think through the right questions. And those would be, how do we sustain the countermeasures, not how do we sustain the result? And then what are the right countermeasure, or what are the right sustaining steps to take for each countermeasure based on that good, better, and best hierarchy. So through this lesson, or through this session, hopefully there have been a few tidbits that you can take away. I think we got just a few minutes here left that can open it up for questions. So Hank?
Well, good. Well, thank you, Shawn. If I have some questions coming in, but if you do hit on your control panel, there's an orange button there that will show your control panel, and then there's a triangle that you can begin to pull down on questions. So if you have any questions, please submit them. Shawn, I did like your not having to resolve the same problem again. I had someone one time say, yeah, I have a lot of skeletons in my closet, but I don't have any twins. So we have one question for you, Shawn.
Sure.
Y'all look at using multiple airproofing or layering in the good, the better, and best countermeasures. So do you see using multiples of those in some cases?
Oh, sure. That's a distinct possibility. If the countermeasure is important enough, hey, maybe that is the right thing to do. You airproof it so it physically can't change, but you still could be doing some training. You could still be doing some visual controls to make sure that that physical lockdown you did doesn't change in the future. So it's kind of almost comes down to that cost benefit analysis. You know, if it's that important, that critical, absolutely put that layering in there. If not, hey, save yourself and the company the time and effort, and don't do the unnecessary work. So it really comes down to the importance of the countermeasure and how badly it needs to be locked down.
Good. I have another one, Shawn, out there. would really like your input on what have you seen as maybe effective ways to help people unlearn their old habits?
Oh, wow. Now, that's a toughie because like I said, you can get some people that are so inground in the ways that they've done things. The best thing that I've seen there is to, number one, involve them in the solution. Let them take part in it, and if they can have a say, they're more likely to be receptive and supportive of any changes that may take place in the future. And if they're there, let's say you've got a packaging line, you've got multiple shifts, they're working one shift, they can be a voice to the other shift saying, yeah, this really does work. I had a say in it, and I let them know about the specifics of what we deal with. That's been the best way that I've seen. It works less if it's like a corporate or outside group that comes in and says, you're going to do it this way. But to involve them, that just really helps with the buy-in. They can see the value that much more as well when it's explained to them.
I have a question for you, Shawn. Someone's asking if they were going to begin to lead continuous improvement. It's a smaller team, smaller company, about 60 folks, and they're in aerospace engineering, so you kind of have that technical background. In a nutshell, how might you start there?
So whenever we were rolling out the WCO group, our world-class organization group, of course, we didn't do it everywhere all at once. It's always great to have a pilot area, a pilot department, a pilot line. Don't know how your company's organized, but to do that and do it well, work through some of the issues, some of the bugs that you're going to experience, because whenever you're rolling out continuous improvement, the implementation of continuous improvement, you can apply continuous improvement to. So if you roll it out company-wide across the whole plant, you may have to go do some backtrack and then retrain people in the future. So to do a pilot in one area, I think would be best, and choose which tools and processes are going to be most effective for that particular group. Don't try to do everything everywhere. Focus in on the things that department cares about, that line cares about. They typically, we do journey mapping, in which we look at the things we want to do in the future, things we want to be driving towards. And so hopefully the folks there, the lines, the departments, have some plans like that, and then see how can you best support those plans going forward. Because if you can latch on to those, that's going to help drive success for you also.
Well, good. Well, I know we're at the end of our hour, just to respect everybody's time. You do have Shawn's email on the bottom of the last slide there. And I did have some requests for the presentation. I will send out the PDF to everybody who attended today. So I apologize if you're getting it twice. I don't want to send you too many emails, but I got several emails asking for it. Again, Shawn, thank you so much for sharing. We had some good comments and feedback on some of the visual slides, and just in general, they really appreciated just a practiced, concise, value-added webinar. Well, thank you all for attending. Thank you again, Shawn.
All right, everyone have a great rest of the week.
Well, good. Well, thank you. And some of y'all know that we will see you next month. We have Nick Vias looking at lean in the supply chain. So thank you all and have a good day.